Brussels Bytes, a podcast about technology, digital society, and European policy. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Dimitar Lilkov.
Hi friends, welcome back to Brussels Bytes. Elections are coming, and with this podcast series, we'll be spending some time talking about the priorities of the next European Commission when it comes to digital. And I'm happy to be joined by Amelia Andersdotter, who is Senior Advisor at Swedish cloud service provider SafeSpring. Also, she has political experience as a member of the European Parliament back in the day between 2011 and 2014. And also, Amelia was a member of the multi-stakeholder advisory group of the Internet Governance Forum, or the IGF. By training, she is a statistician and a mathematician. Amelia, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Dimitar.
Also, I had the pleasure to collaborate with Amelia on a recent publication by the Martin Centre, and maybe just a moment for a bit of self-praise and advertisement. The Martin Centre has developed a series of publications labeled the 7Ds for Sustainability, which is our contribution for the next Commission mandate. And with the Martin Centre, together with a range of experts in different fields, defense, digital, decarbonization, and a couple more, we sat down and we put forward very specific policy recommendations for the next mandate. And as I mentioned, together with Amelia, we collaborate on the chapter on digital, and she drafted for us the first chapter on secure digital infrastructure and hardware. So make sure to check it out online or in print. Now, let's jump straight into our discussion. And Amelia, part of your chapter on hardware and digital, there's a specific sentence which resonated with me very deeply. And it goes like this. The EU has to answer crucial questions about these ... such as how to transform its legally established values into verifiably testable criteria for technology. Translate this for our audience.
So one of the bits that you left out of my resume is actually that I've been working on hardware standards for 7 years, looking at how do we build Wi-Fi technologies, and specifically the chips that enable access points and phones to communicate. And so what it turns out is that in the European Union, there's lots of legislation that protects consumers and other radio devices from undue interference from Wi-Fi chips. And so there's all of these harmonized standards, they're called, developed by the European Technology Standards Institute, ETSI, that have testable criteria for every Wi-Fi chip that is placed on the European market to make sure that it doesn't cause undue inference, that it is not at a harmful level for human health purposes, and basically that the device works as intended when coexisting with all of the other weather radars, airplane radars, other safety mechanisms, mobile phones, what have you, dog collars that have shiny bits for the owners to know where their dog is. And so this is a very physical system. So all of those harmonized standards, they're described in such a way that you can have deterministic responses to the question that you're asking about the technology given particular physical conditions. So for instance, in 25 degrees Celsius in an indoor environment, your Wi-Fi device will always behave like this. And so the reason that we can do this for radio technologies, and we do it also for other safe areas of safety legislation, like for instance, cement, a sand-based technology that we use in a lot of buildings. We have verifiable criteria that makes us know that in given temperature ranges, cement doesn't break, which is excellent, because if we didn't have those temperature ranges and that knowledge about the quality of the cement we're using in buildings, we could have collapsing buildings, which serves nobody's interest. But when it comes to software, we're actually having this challenge that, firstly, just on theoretical grounds, we can never 100%. So in a physical environment, we can 100% prove that we have deterministic properties of the mechanical system given certain physical conditions. But with software, there's something called the halting problem, that means we can never 100% prove that an algorithm will terminate. Even if it's always terminated in the past, there's always a theoretical possibility that it will not terminate in the future. So that's one challenge to the current safety standard system of the European Union, that it's just not theoretically possible to use the same deterministic testing algorithms on a software system. But then the other challenge is that it's not necessarily known what our legally established values are. And I don't think we have, across the whole European Union area, a common understanding of the concept of like verification. So there's some, the biggest challenges here, I would argue, are conceptual. So how do we deal with statistical safety, basically? And then also, how do we ensure that we legally establish our values sufficiently precise that we all agree on what it is that we've actually put on paper?
I can immediately tell that you're a statistician and a mathematician by education, so it's a pleasure to address these issues from this angle. But let me interrupt you here and ask you: didn't we get these criteria, but with the likes of the GDPR, let's say, or certain piece of European legislation in the last couple of years? This is what the European Commission will tell you: we have these criteria or not.
I mean, so it sort of depends. So when I was in the European Parliament, one of the things that I reflected upon a lot is positive and negative obligations. How do you create legislation? What is the difference between US tech lobbyism or tech lobbyism in the European institutions that is in the interest of US technology companies, and lobbyism that is in the interest of European technology companies? And so one of the things I realized is that actually in common law systems, which would be the UK, Ireland, the US, India. So we have representation of common law also in the European Union. Most laws tell judges what they cannot do. And this is because a judge in a common law system is assumed to be able to do whatever they want in the absence of restrictions. So whenever you bring a conflict to the judge can decide that he's competent to arbitrate on it, whether or not the legislator has foreseen the conflict. Now, in a Napoleonic system or continental European system, even in Scandinavia, actually judges can only rule on conflicts that the legislator has foreseen. If the legislator hasn't written a piece of law that says that the conflict is there, the judge can do nothing. And so this means that the legislator needs to be a lot more proactive in defining what is a legitimate conflict to have. And I think while legislators are working on this, certainly with the GDPR and so forth, you will see if you look at the legislation and what they call now the risk-based approach, that this United States model of thinking about how laws are made, namely restrict the court from doing things freely, has actually had, I would argue, an unproductively large influence on how specific legal provisions are made. And this is across the board, like not just in GDPR, but also when we look at formulations about hate speech or how to define the European interest in other ways, like protect children against immoral content or anti-extremism measure to combat, fake news or this type of disinformation campaigns. And I think here is something, that is a real kind of fundamental challenge for Europe. How does Europe formulate its own values independently of external pressures?
Mm-hmm. One of the aims of our publication on your future recommendations was exactly talking about these verifiable, testable criteria, and also if we have them or if we don't have them, also how to promote European companies, because the legal framework is one part of the equation. But as unfortunately we've come to see in the last couple of years, having the rule book and having even the best quote-unquote regulation doesn't guarantee you the top spot when it comes to competitiveness. And in this case, I wanted to pick your brain. How can we make sure, not only from a legal perspective, but from a practical perspective or incentivizing, how to make sure European digital companies thrive, the million-euro question, and in the next European Commission mandate, how can we make sure that they become even better and more competitive?
Well, I love mentioning European companies for sure. And I also work for a European company that is trying to make it big in the area of compliant Kubernetes and cloud services, which we have a lot of cloud companies in Europe that I think aren't very visible in Brussels. And part of that problem is really with the European companies themselves. In most European countries, companies don't really have to compete for the attention of legislators. So Brussels traditionally has worked in such a way that there might be a champion in a member state that is then being protected by its government in the European legislative processes. And maybe what we need is more aggressive companies that are also willing to stand up for themselves. And I know that this is a transformation that is happening. But I would say, European companies need to become more assertive. They need to become more visionary in their political work rather than just complain about legislative proposals. They need to make their own visions for this is what we want the future to be. And that was always very distressing, also being a European legislator, that these American companies, they will come in and build grand visions for the future. And then European companies, they come in and ask for subsidies. I think this shows some form of mentality difference that needs to be bridged. But we also have a lot of, I think, hidden European companies that make great products that maybe don't have resources or necessarily even an interest in lobbying because they're already so prominent. ESET in Slovakia is a cybersecurity firm with offices in 130 countries. They're like huge. And still, you will find probably here in the European Brussels debates that ESET is rarely mentioned explicitly, even though it's like one of the world's
That's true, actually.
foremost companies. And we'd have to ask, why is it that ESET doesn't find it interesting to do lobbyism in Brussels? I think somebody from Brussels should go to ESET and ask, because they're really that big in their sector that it's mind-boggling how they're not represented in these discussions here. We have other exciting companies like Digicommunications from Romania, which is the only transnational telecommunications operator from an Eastern European country. Belgium is the only Western European country that has allowed the Digicommunications to operate both 5G networks and fiber networks on their national market. Otherwise, Western European countries, quite frankly, they're very good at keeping Eastern European countries out of their market. This is something that I argue in my text for the 70s needs to change. Western European countries need to be more open to Eastern European industrial influences.
Is this explicit discrimination or obstacles, or it's implicit? How are these companies kept at bay in Western Europe?
In the field of mobile network communications by spectrum licensees. And so you will simply put in security requirements and spectrum licenses that ensure that you only award licenses to national entities. And you see this, for instance, in France, that there is no company that has bought a French spectrum license, neither for 3G, 4G, nor 5G, that doesn't have its headquarters in France. And I haven't done a similar review for Germany, but I would be surprised if the results were very different there. But we also have other like Revolut from Lithuania is one of these super cool financial services that, because of an innovative measure in MiFID II by the European Commission, has just been able to take over European markets on payment services because they're doing it so much better than any of the Western European banks. So Brussels is in this really good position to open up competition and make sure that Eastern European companies get the space that they deserve. There's Workable, it's like a cool Greek firm that does meeting scheduling for human resources entities. And Spotify from Sweden, of course, I have to mention because it's my home country and I think it's a very known country internationally. But, and here is something that I would like more people in Brussels to reflect on. I think Workable, Spotify, and the Belgian company that's called Gorilla that makes pricing algorithms for the energy sector, they are excellent examples of what I call the European launching problem. Namely, that a European tech company is likely first to launch in their member state, which makes sense. Then they go to either the Netherlands or the UK. Then they go to the United States. And only after they've consolidated their position on the United States market do they come back and try to launch in other European markets than their home state, Netherlands or the UK. And I don't understand why it is that you need to go to the US first, because that's a huge competitive disadvantage in comparison with American companies, actually. American companies have the advantage that when they launch on their home market, the US, they're already on the US market. And so the rest of Europe is basically free for the picking. And we know also from economic research that a company is at a disadvantage when it leaves its own market. And even though, okay, we can argue that a Swedish company, for instance, has Sweden as its home market, I would say that the European market should be the logical next market rather than the American market. And it's just a pattern that I've seen in how companies launch. I'm not quite sure how to solve it.
The intuitive answer here is that it's because of English as the lingua franca and the access to funding. Is this the simple answer to why they scale in such a pattern, or it's more intricate than that?
Probably you're right.
Yeah.
Like access to funding is something that at the European level we can work on. English language, I think, will be very difficult for us to solve because we have this united in diversity approach, which fundamentally also is desirable for the European Union to keep.
No, you put the problem really, really concisely. They launch and then they scale to the Anglosphere, I guess in 90% of the cases, and then they have to come back, but it's more difficult for them to scale in other countries. Okay, you mentioned subsidies, so let's continue on this track. What can we actually do when it comes to policy to support these companies? So should we just throw more money at them, or it's more complicated?
I mean, if you look at the example with Revolut and the MiFID II legislation, there might be ways in which, if we go back to your access to funding hypothesis for the launch patterns, that maybe it's something about how we're regulating the loans market, like credit markets in Europe, that it's simply difficult for companies to have access to credit on reasonable terms. I recall one of the things that I heard, it's many years ago now, more than 10, that in Europe, when you're making a startup, it's difficult to avoid personal liability for your company defaulting in a way which isn't the case in the US. And so in the US, you can be a serial entrepreneur in the sense that you start a company, you fail, you start a company, you fail, and it doesn't have an impact on your personal credit record. So you and your family can still own a car, they can still own a house, your children can still go to college because you isolate the financial risk into the corporate entity. And so apparently in many European jurisdictions, this is not as possible. And maybe this is an area where the European Union could look, whether it's easier to make changes. Another area that came in the same discussion was competition clauses. So when you're restricting former employees from engaging in competing activities, and this might make it difficult for, if you work at Ericsson, let's say, and you have a great idea, but your managers won't let you pursue it. Then if you leave Ericsson, actually you will be barred for 2 years from pursuing your idea, which makes it competitively, like after 2 years in the mobile networking space, if it was a software implemented plan you had, it's already out of date.
Yeah.
You can't do anything with your idea anymore. But in California, a judge apparently nullified all competition clauses sometime in the 19th century. And that's why around Google, Apple, these companies that are based in California, you have an enormously dynamic innovation ecosystem, because as soon as an employee is disgruntled, they leave and they start a competitor. And then the company ends up having to rebuy that competitor at a later time. And so now when we're anyway looking at how to spend these huge amounts of, I think, 750 billion euro investment package, maybe we can look a bit at how to set up these, competition clause sandboxes with some of that money. We could look at how to make investment and loans accessible for small and medium-sized entities that want to change or experiment with their launch patterns.
The case with the Recovery and Resilience Fund you just mentioned, my fear, and we have already research and data backing it up, is that all of these hundreds of billions of euros, unfortunately, many member states are doing business as usual, meaning municipalities or public bodies get this money, but they spend them just to boost businesses or support certain industries or something like this, but they do not fundamentally propel new competitive models or actual breakthrough change. And I strongly agree with the point you made about personal liability. By the way, this is also discussed in the second chapter of our publication on digital, where one of the authors talks specifically about this and the lack of harmonization of insolvency proceedings in between European member states, meaning that if you want to scale, there's lots of legal uncertainty about what happens if you want to invest in a company which is another member state. You don't know if it goes bankrupt. We don't have second chance clauses and stuff like that. Maybe let's zoom out a bit on this. I'm very tempted to talk about your life as a policymaker, as we already mentioned, and you can reflect on your experience, of course, but we have an election coming in next 5 years. What will be the biggest challenges or opportunities for policymakers, specifically on digital? And if you were sitting maybe in that chamber, what would you work on, or what coalitions you would try to make when it comes to digital?
I mean, if you're not in the EPP group in the European Parliament, normally your challenge is how do you get the EPP group to do something? And I suppose if I was in the chamber, this would continue to be my challenge. But I think a really important aspect for European policymakers to focus on in the next 5 years is how to actually enforce the large troves of laws that they're making. And I come back to this, we talked about, do we know what European values are? You say yes, because we put them in the legislation. But actually, European legislators have made a lot of legislation in the last 10 years. There's maybe 6, 7, 8 now cybersecurity laws that neither of them, it's obvious what they're actually going to mean for companies such as the one I work for. Like, what are the concrete measures that we need to undertake in our daily activities to conform with European law? And so I think the European Parliament, also the Commission, should work more on figuring out ways of following up on previous decisions. And I know that this probably for the Parliament doesn't immediately sound sexy, but I argue that it very much can be. For instance, we have a data protection and security essential requirement on radio technologies in the European Union since 1999, but we have no harmonized standard that specify what that essential requirement actually means. So even though we have the legal protection whenever we use our mobile phone, that our mobile phone does not leak data about us, we have no way of determining that this legal requirement is actually being respected because nobody has ever implemented Article 3E of the Radio Equipment Directive. So why doesn't somebody in the European Parliament sit down and start reflecting on why is that? I think we have now 4 or 5 competing breach notification laws in the GDPR, in the NIS directive, in the e-privacy directive. There's a 4th one which escapes my mind right now, but I made these surveys on and off. And so why doesn't somebody sit down and look, okay, all of these different reporting obligations, what do they lead to in different member states? Can we make pretty graphs or infographics that somehow help us gain insights on how breach notifications are used, whether they're informing consumers, are they informing policymakers, are they informing companies about what kind of protective measures that they need? What is happening with all of these breach notifications that we've obliged people to start generating? And I think there's, at least intellectually very satisfying tasks that have the potential of also demonstrating to citizens that the European institutions don't just talk and write lots of weird laws. They also make sure that the laws have a practical impact in the lives of citizens and work to improve things.
This fully resonates, by the way, with the Martin Center's overall narrative when it comes to digital for the next mandate is getting serious on implementation. We've seen the amount of paperwork and new statutes which have been adopted in the last couple of years, and rightfully so. But specifically when we talk about the implementation of the DMA, the DSA, we desperately want to avoid the mistakes from the GDPR when it comes to, let's say, national administrations not being able to financially or technically handle cases. And we'll simply need more manpower in Brussels for this and many other avenues. So I'm fully with you on this one. You mentioned cybersecurity and the avalanche of different strategies and documents. Maybe let's spend a couple of minutes on cyber resilience as the bigger term maybe. In your paper, you talk about cyber resilience, of course, and also building the digital infrastructures of the future. I'll be really happy if you can share a couple of ideas when it comes to actual resilience and how can we imagine these infrastructures of the future, European ones.
Well, firstly, there are several ways in which Europe can do this. One of the ways I think we should make our markets more resilient in Europe is by ensuring that Western European companies more often open up their markets for Eastern European companies. We have masses of resources in Eastern Europe in terms of really qualified programmers, really qualified network administrators, system administrators, what have you. Currently, we're squandering that resource for no good reason. Also really good security people in Eastern Europe, like I already mentioned. So having more of an onus on the Western European countries to open up their markets, I think is really important. And it will also help Eastern European markets to be more open to ideas like climate resilience. Because currently a lot of Eastern European countries are sitting with older infrastructure that they might need to replace, but they don't have the domestic knowledge on how to do that. And so that makes them more dependent on Western European countries. So Western European countries need to show that they also want to be dependent on Eastern Europe, as it were. Now, other measures that could be undertaken, actually, again, examples from the financial industries. I've talked about MiFID II now twice. But if we look at the DORA legislation, which obliges banks to procure from at least 2 separate commercial entities when they're setting up their digital infrastructures, this is an excellent requirement to place on more entities, such as public institutions. Why is it that currently in Europe we're having public institutions that are building themselves into the software solutions of single entities like only Microsoft or only Amazon or only Google, and they have absolutely no obligation to make sure that they're resilient against market changes or changing geopolitical tides? DORA and the financial markets and how we're regulating them shows that it is possible and that European Union can make strong impacts on procurement patterns. It needs to be less conservative with how it makes these bold, I think, how it places these bold requirements on entities. I'm also, maybe because I worked with technical standards for 7 years, I think the European Union needs to leverage its own harmonized standards framework more. And I know there's been, currently the focus in the harmonized standards discussion in Europe has been very much on who gets to make the decisions. Can American companies be the chair of committees? Why is that? Is this good? But it's very cosmetic. Actually, this is a very cosmetic approach to standards. We need to think about more, how do we leverage the harmonized standards framework to create exactly what we began talking about, testable, verifiable criteria for how European values are implemented.
And one of the biggest notions, in this city, when it comes to standards and values, do you think we can actually export them? Can we be this global force of good which raises the golden standard and avoids a race to the bottom when it comes to all of these technologies?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have to remember that when we look globally, actually the European way of creating harmonized standard, testing values, verifying, what I described earlier as being this kind of legislators defining the scope for judges to act. This is the dominant legal system in the world. So also when you look internationally, both in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, for instance, the vast majority of those countries have some form of technical verification system that is very similar to what the European Union adopts, not to the way that it would work in the United States. And so we have to remember also that the European system, for all of its many flaws and oddities, it's also very suitable for a lot of regions in the world, because most countries find themselves in the position where they have, neighbors that maybe they've made war with for 400 years before now trying to engage in productive trade. So Europe is really like this testing ground for how do you switch geopolitical adversity into geopolitical cooperation. And I think that's a strength that we can leverage if we start thinking about, rather than the cosmetics around how decisions are made in the standards, we need to start focusing on what kind of decisions do we want these institutions to make. And can we help, for instance, European companies to contribute to that? Can we, our government institutions, perhaps contribute to that when it comes to questions of, how to interpret the law and so forth? There's a number of examples I can surely expand upon in perpetuity, but
it's important to hear from you as well, coming from the completely different background to most of the guests I have, that the quest for not only creating those verifiable standards but also exporting them and positively influencing the global scene can actually be accomplished, and there's a lot more to be done in the next mandate. Friends, this was the voice of Amelia Andersdotter. Make sure to check our 7Ds publication so you can see more about her own ideas on creating digital resilience, ensuring sovereignty online, and building the future digital infrastructures. Amelia, thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was today's episode of Brussels Bytes. Follow us on SoundCloud for more.